You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another Dragon Ball video. That's right, 2 in a row. I'm in a Dragon Ball type mood. What can I say? But I've mentioned this in multiple videos, the fact that Dragon Ball, the original, is my favorite Dragon Ball series. I like it more than Z, and I like it more than GT and Super. But obviously the one that most people are going to be concerned about is why do I like it more than Z? Never mind the fact that I already did a video on why I like GT more than Z, but let's talk about why I like this one the most. Why is Dragon Ball, the original series, my favorite? There's a couple of reasons, and let's just start with the one that's a matter of taste. First off, so obviously this first point is completely subjective, but I am much more of a fan of adventure than I am action. So with Dragon Ball Z being primarily action-based and having very little adventure, if any, Dragon Ball scratches that itch a lot more, as does GT for that matter. Part of the problem I have with Dragon Ball Z when comparing it to Dragon Ball, and I've mentioned this in several videos, is that Dragon Ball Z follows a formula. Dragon Ball Z will introduce a new villain who is stronger than Goku. Goku will train, Goku will fight them, gain a new transformation, and then defeat the enemy. There's some variations in this formula, but it tends to stick pretty close to it. That's not to say that all the fights are the same, because they can have interesting outcomes, and Goku isn't always the one to get the final blow. And in fact, there are fights where Goku basically loses and then is saved. For instance, Yajirobe's the one who actually defeated Vegeta, when you think about it. But yeah, the adventure is so much more fun to me than the formula of just a fight, a fight, a fight. Seeing Goku go on a big quest to find the Dragon Balls, seeing him train with Master Roshi, seeing him fight in the World Tournaments. And yeah, I know there's World Tournaments in Dragon Ball Z as well. And obviously there's tournaments in basically every Dragon Ball entry. But those early ones are just so much more special. There's so much more build-up to them. There's so much more payoff. They're very different from the later ones, because in the later tournaments, you're really only worrying about which Z fighter is going to come out on top. Whereas in original Dragon Ball, while it is true Goku and Krillin can basically go through anyone there was less certainty in it. We were still figuring that out, right? Because they had just finished their training with Roshi. All they'd been doing was manual labor for months. And obviously this is referring to the 21st World Tournament, but still. So, yeah, that's one distinction, right, is that I like the action more than the adventure, and Z is a lot more formulaic. But another thing that I tend to prefer original over Z is that original just flows better as a series. Each arc flows more into the next arc better than it does in Z. It feels more like a cohesive series, like Dragon Ball is just one solid series, whereas Z, yeah, there's always the continuity, but each arc, each saga, feels like its own distinct series. You know what I mean? Like, the Android saga is distinct from the Frieza saga. And they're both distinct from the Buu saga. The only one you could even really make the argument that they really tie together is the Saiyan saga and the Frieza saga, because they're obviously connected. I also feel like the world of Dragon Ball just feels a lot more lived in than it does in Z. In Z, you don't really think of the expanded world all that much. It's all really focused on the fight, and a few locations that are tied to the fight, and the characters, and in some cases, kind of factions, but not really. Dragon Ball, the actual world of original Dragon Ball, feels like a world. It doesn't just feel like the next map in a tournament fighter. You know what I mean? And yeah, there's exceptions to this, and there is some world building in Z. But world building, I feel like, is done a hell of a lot more in original. You can make the argument that that's because it's the original series. It needs to do some world building. But also, Goku has a ton of character development in original. In Z, he's a relatively static character. He has some development, sure, mainly just in the form of new transformations. But Goku actually is a really fleshed out character, and a lot of people who just start with Z don't even realize that, because they haven't seen Goku grow from the naive fucking forest-dwelling monkey boy into an actual heroic, well-rounded individual who has a family. I also just feel like the fantasy setting of original Dragon Ball gels better with the series than the sci-fi setting of Z and GT does. That's not to say that fantasy is inherently better than sci-fi. I would actually say, by and large, I prefer sci-fi. It just depends on the context in the series. But Dragon Ball was a magical, mythical adventure where you're seeing these characters go in this fantasy world. And, there's the Dragon Balls, right? They're this mysterious thing. And there's actually a different origin for the Dragon Balls that's mentioned in the original series. It's a legend that Roshi tells of it, about how there was originally only one Dragon Ball, Which I guess you could kind of maybe tie to the Super Dragon Balls if you want to say, hey, maybe that's where that legend came from. Not to mention, Original has such a great cast of characters that all just kind of get pushed to the side in Z. Like, yeah, they're still there, except Launch. Launch is in, like, what, 2 scenes of Z? Toriyama literally forgot that Launch existed. He even said that in multiple interviews. I will admit that the ending to Original is lackluster, but then again, so is the ending to Z. But Original literally just ends with it saying, watch Dragon Ball Z. Like, that's literally the ending to Original. It breaks the fourth wall and says, to watch Goku's continued adventures, watch Dragon Ball Z. Again, Dragon Ball Z has a pretty lame ending too, to be honest. Like, the only Dragon Ball series to me that has a satisfactory ending is GT. But another thing I like about the original series in comparison to Z is that everything's on a smaller scale. Like, things being on a grander scale can be interesting and can be fun, but the smaller scale makes everything feel more real. Like, it's still like this crazy fantastical world that's filled with all these weird fucking furry characters, robots, demons, and fucking movie monsters, and like Bruce Lee and a bunch of other random shit thrown in because Toriyama's a fucking maniac and I love him. But the smaller scale makes the characters just feel more developed. Like, everything's more personal, right? Like, Goku wants to train and be a good fighter and fight in the tournament. They want to gather the Dragon Balls. Like, the quest for the Dragon Balls is already great. Like, the original arc, the Pilaf arc, where they're just searching for the Dragon Balls, is part of what makes me love it so much. Then we have stuff like the King Piccolo arc, which is one of my favorite arcs. It's my second favorite arc overall. The Androids arc is my favorite arc. Again, that's one point I always give to Z, is that the Android saga, again, specifically, that's all of it, including Cell, is peak Dragon Ball. There's no arguing that. The Androids arc is peak. Other than that, there's the King Piccolo saga, and I fucking love the King Piccolo saga. The deaths of Krillin and Roshi actually feel impactful, despite the fact that the Dragon Balls are still a factor. Yeah, getting back to the fact that characters were pushed aside, right? Like Yamcha, Krillin, Master Roshi, Oolong, Puar. Like, these characters all get pushed to the side. Bulma as well. Like, Bulma's still there throughout, and Roshi's still there throughout. Like, I'd say Bulma is the one that gets the best treatment in Z out of the original cast. And don't get me wrong, I like the Z cast a lot as well. I mean, Vegeta is one of my favorite characters. Vegeta is my all-time second favorite character, second only to Bardock. So obviously my favorite individual characters are from Z, but as a whole cohesive cast, I much prefer the group we had in Dragon Ball. Like, there's so many memorable characters that just get sidelined or outright forgotten about. I also just feel like the pacing is better. And again, that might come down to the fact that it's an adventure series, and that probably also just comes down to the fact that the world feels more fleshed out and there's better world building. But I love the pacing of the original Dragon Ball. There's not a single moment that I feel drags. Like, in Dragon Ball Z, there's the Frieza fight, and I know I go on about that a lot because of filler and whatnot. But I mean, even parts that I really like the Cell games, are pretty long. And, you know, there's probably some pacing issues with that, too. It's been a while since I've watched the Cell saga. Nevertheless, I overlook it because the Cell saga is a fucking masterpiece. But I'm sure that if I were to rewatch it, that overall, Dragon Ball Z has a lot more issues with pacing. The filler in original just is much more, like, fun. It's new stuff. Whereas that's also the case often with Z. Z has a combination of original filler and filler that just drags out fights. And both can be good or bad. Honestly, like, with Dragon Ball Z, like, the worst filler for me is probably the Frieza fight. I know I keep going on about it, but the Frieza fight is so long. But the Garlic Jr. saga is, like, the worst saga of Z, so that's pretty bad, and that's all original filler, too. But there's lots of cool things introduced in original Dragon Ball that just kind of get, like, forgotten about or dismissed in Z. The thing is original has a very... Like I said, it's a fantasy, right? Like, you feel like the setting for martial arts and stuff like that really fit well with that universe. Remember, Piccolo was a demon originally. Like, aliens weren't really a factor. Like, there were still, like, the aliens in Penguin Village, because, you know, when they go there, there's all the stuff from Dr. Slump that is sci-fi. But by and large, it was a fantasy series. And, you know, Z took what was predominantly a fantasy and turned it into a sci-fi. And I think the sci-fi worked. Like, they're still good in it. Like I said, I still love Dragon Ball Z, and I feel like Dragon Ball Z has the best moments. But the thing is that's just moments. I think as a solid series, just watching it all the way through as a bingeable show, original Dragon Ball just feels more like a series. It feels more like a show that you're sitting and watching. It's not like with Z, where there's like, oh yeah, that fight where Gohan fights Perfect Cell. that's fucking peak. Or the Boo Saga, I think, is actually really good, too. Like, I think the Boo Saga is actually underrated. The Boo Saga actually, I think it's weird, it's divisive. I love the Boo Saga, but there's all these moments that really stand out in Z. But original is just consistently good. It's more consistent. It's more consistent quality. It doesn't have the same high peaks that Z does, but as a series throughout, it's much more watchable. Again, both shows are great. I love Dragon Ball. And I like to view Dragon Ball as one solid series as well, right? With Original Z and GT. And, you know, Super has moments I like. Super has a lot less moments I like. But Super does have good movies, and that'll be the subject for a future video. But I think I've gotten a little bit rambly, but I think you understand mainly, right? The consistency and the cohesion as a series. Not to mention the fact that it's adventure versus action. There's just a lot of things, both subjectively and objectively, that make the series, to me, personally better. That said, I'm pretty sure Z also has more inconsistencies, but that's like on a writing level. But that's also probably just due to the fact that Z's longer, because Original has a bunch of inconsistencies too, because Toriyama has all sorts of plot holes and contradictions in his stories. GT actually has the least amount of inconsistencies, but again, that's also because it's the shortest. And at the end of the day, when I'm watching Dragon Ball, I always have more fun going back to Original. That said, the series is great, and also Z is so much better than Super. So at least there's that. Anyway, this has been Fugitive Red Eye. I keep rambling on and going all over the place. Hopefully this video was cohesive enough. Have a good one. Toodles!
Looks like you're going to the Shadow Realm, Jimbo.
I'm gonna fucking die here, Jack!